It started with a sound that didn't belong in the mountains at night. Not the soft hiss of rain on the metal roof, not the wind in the pines, or the distant hum of the highway down in the valley. This was sharper, a scraping, almost a knocking, mixed with a broken little cry that threaded straight through the walls of Walter Hayes's cabin and found the one place in him that still refused to shut down. He was standing at the sink in his small kitchen, rinsing out a single coffee mug. Same mug he used every night. TV off, radio off, just the drip of the faucet and his own breathing for company. His old cat, Muffin, was circling his ankles, hoping he might forget he'd already fed her. The noise came again. Closer this time. For a second, Walter thought, I should ignore it. Nothing good comes to the door after dark out here. But the sound wasn't meant. It was desperate. The cabin sat halfway up a hillside in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, down a gravel road most folks avoided after sunset. When his wife Eleanor was alive, the two of them had called it their little slice of heaven. Now, 3 years after she was gone, it sometimes felt more like a waiting room at the end of the world. He put the mug down, wiped his hands on a towel, and listened. There it was again. Claws on wood. A thin, raw call that didn't sound like any stray house cat he'd ever heard. Muffin froze, tail fluffed, staring at the back door. Well, Walter muttered, more to her than to himself. Guess we'd better see who's visiting. He flipped on the porch light and opened the door just a crack. The storm wind pushed in first, cold and damp and smelling of wet leaves. Then something low and fast shot past his boots and into the kitchen like a streak of living lightning. Whatever it was hit the linoleum, slid halfway across the room, crashed into the cabinet, and spun around. Muffin exploded straight up in the air, all indignation and whiskers. Walter grabbed the counter to steady himself. In the yellow porch light, in that shocked second, he saw the truth of it. Not a dog, not a neighbor's cat. A young bobcat, soaked to the skin, eyes too big for his narrow face, shoulders sharp where they should have been rounded. He went straight for Muffin's bowl like he'd been aimed at it his whole life. The bowl clattered against the baseboard as the bobcat buried his head in it, inhaling every last bit of kibble as it might vanish. Muffin let out an offended yowl that probably woke up half the county, then backed up under a chair. Still puffed like a dandelion gone wrong, Walter just stood there, hand still on the doorknob, watching. The rain hammered the roof. The porch light buzzed. Somewhere out in the trees, an owl called once, and then went quiet. Every sensible thought lined up in his head. This is wild. This is dangerous. Call someone. Shut the door. You are a 70-year-old widower. You do not need a bobcat in your kitchen. But the little rescue bobcat lifted his head just long enough to check if anyone was going to take the food away, then went right back to eating, panting between bites. Muffin hissed, then crept forward a few inches, curiosity wrestling with outrage. Walter could feel his heart doing that uneven dance it did sometimes now. Not from fear, exactly, from something like recognition. He'd been empty for a long time. The cabin is full of silence, the chair by the window, the single plate on the table, and now, in the space of a heartbeat, his quiet life had been broken open by a dripping, half-grown bobcat who clearly hadn't read any of the rules. He took a slow breath and shut the door against the rain. That, he told the room, voice shaking just a little, was probably a mistake. The bobcat finished the last crumb in the bowl, licked the floor, then looked up at Walter with those pale, wild eyes. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Old man, young predator. Both are a little lost. Both were a little hungry in ways that had nothing to do with food. Muffin, deciding that if anyone was going to die tonight, it wasn't going to be her, made the first move. She crept around the table, ears sideways, and sat down 3 feet from the newcomer. They exchanged a long look that only cats and bobcats really understand. Then, in a move that would replay in Walter's mind 1,000 times, Muffin leaned forward and bumped her head gently against his shoulder. Just once. Great, Walter sighed, Now it's a committee decision.
Later, when there was time to think, he would remember all the reasons he shouldn't have let that rescue bobcat stay. The laws, the risk, the simple fact that wild things belong in wild places. But on that night, in that small kitchen in the Blue Ridge, what he felt most wasn't fear. It was relief. Benefit that house wasn't so quiet he could hear his own thoughts echo. Benefit that someone else, even a soaked, confused, slightly ridiculous bobcat, needed him to stand upright and figure this out. If you've ever stood alone in your own kitchen at the end of a long day, listening to a silence that feels heavier than it should, you might understand why he didn't pick up the phone right then. He grabbed another can of food from the pantry. Muffin complained. The bobcat watched his every move, muscles humming under that wet coat. "My name's Walter," he said quietly, like introductions might help, even across species. "And you, my friend, might just be the best mistake I've ever made." He didn't know yet that this moment, this choice to feed a stranger with claws, would change the shape of his days. He didn't know yet about the goofy antics, the shredded couch cushions, the fridge raids, the way this bobcat would walk the thin line between wild and home and pull Walter along with him. All he knew was that for the first time in years, his cabin in the mountains didn't feel empty. Before we follow what happened to that soaked little wanderer and how a rescue bobcat can turn a quiet life upside down, we need to go back for a minute. We need to see what Walter's days looked like before that knock on the door. The mug, the chair, the window, the silence he thought he'd made peace with. If any part of this feels familiar, if you know what it is to live with more memories than visitors, stay with me. The next part is where you'll see why that wild heart knew exactly which cabin to choose. Before the bobcat ever set a paw inside that little mountain cabin, Walter's days were already shaped by three quiet things: a chair, a mug, and a window. If you had walked in back then, you might have thought nothing was happening in his life. Just an older man in the Blue Ridge Mountains, retired, keeping to himself. But hidden inside all those small movements was the real story of what loss does to a person. When the casseroles stop coming and the phone stops ringing as often. Most mornings started the same way. Walter would pad into the kitchen in his socks, the house still dim, the mountains outside just a dark shape beyond the glass. His hand went automatically to the cupboard where the mugs lived. Without thinking, he reached for two, one for him, one for Eleanor. He'd stand there, both handles hooked on his fingers, and feel the moment when his brain caught up with his muscles. There was always that small pause, like the world held its breath. Then he'd set one mug back on the shelf very gently, as if making too much noise might wake a life that wasn't there anymore. He never said anything out loud. The only sound was the coffee maker sputtering to life and Muffin's soft chirp as she wound around his ankles, hopeful as ever. That chipped blue mug carried years with it. Road trips, gas stations, bad motel coffee that somehow tasted better because Eleanor was there to roll her eyes at it. In the quiet of the kitchen, with the hills still waking up, he felt every one of those years gathered in his hands. When the coffee was ready, he'd move to the chair. It sat by the big front window, angled just right so he could see the line of ridges fading into the distance. They'd picked this spot together when they first bought the place. "We'll grow old here," she'd said, sinking into the cushions. He'd laughed and told her they were already halfway there. Now it was his spot alone. Muffin usually claimed the armrest, tail wrapped over her paws, pretending she didn't care if he touched her, but leaning in when he did. Walter would sit, mug warm between his palms, and watch the morning build layer by layer. Mist lifting off the trees, a hawk riding the air currents, the gravel road staying empty. He used to narrate those mornings to Eleanor. Little things. The doe brought her fawn back, or neighbor's dog dug up my tulips again. Without her, the words dried up. The window became less a view and more a screensaver. Something was moving in front of him, while everything inside felt stuck. Around mid-morning, he'd find himself reaching for his phone. There was a single voicemail he kept,
tucked away like a photograph in a drawer. Eleanor's voice, a little rushed, a little out of breath. She was reminding him to grab milk on his way back from town. Then she added, "Love you, Slowpoke," and laughed at herself. He had listened to that message so many times he knew the exact crackle before she said his name. More than once, standing in the hallway with his thumb hovering over the screen, he thought about deleting it. Maybe it would be healthier. Maybe it was strange to hold on so tight to a voice that wasn't coming back. Every time, the same thing happened. His chest tightened, his hand shook just enough, and he'd lock the phone instead, slide it into his pocket and walk back to the window. From the outside, it looked like a simple routine. Coffee, chair, window, silent phone. For Walter, it was a way of not falling apart all at once. If you've ever had a chair you sit in the same way every night, or a favorite mug that somehow makes the day feel tolerable, you know how those little things can hold you together when nothing else makes sense. They're not dramatic. They're not exciting. They're just steady. He still did chores, of course. Checked the roof, split wood, drove down into town for groceries and the occasional hardware store trip. Neighbors knew him as the quiet man up on the hill. Friendly enough, but quick to wave goodbye. The part of him that used to linger in the aisle and tell a story or two stayed home. The cabin had a kind of careful order to it. Tools lined up in the shed, dishes washed and stacked, mail sorted and filed. On the surface, it was the life of a man who had things under control. But now and then, something slipped. He'd set 2 plates on the table and only noticed when Muffin jumped up and sniffed at the empty one. He'd catch himself starting to call out, "Elle, did you see?" And the sentence would die halfway in the air, hanging there like dust in a beam of light. That's the thing about Los. People don't always talk about. It's not just the big anniversaries or the dates circled on a calendar. It's these tiny, domestic misfires. Your body remembers a life your mind is still trying to accept is gone. Some evenings, Walter would reach for the radio, thinking maybe some old country song might keep the walls from closing in. Then he'd remember the way Eleanor used to sing along, off-key and fearless, and his hand would pull back. Better to keep the house quiet than risk waking the ache. So the chair, the mug, and the window did most of the heavy lifting. They weren't exciting. They didn't fix anything, but they gave his days a shape where nothing else did. In a world that had shrunk down to a gravel driveway, a grocery store, and a tree line, those 3 things were the corners of his map. If any of this sounds a little like your own mornings or your own evenings, you're not alone. A lot of us get good at living small after a loss. Not because we've stopped caring, but because the big feelings feel too heavy to carry all day. What Walter didn't know, sitting there with his coffee and his silence, was that life had already started planning an interruption. Something wild and unexpected, trotting toward his door on quiet paws. The chair would soon have claw marks. The mug would be in danger every time a tail swung past. The window would become a stage for a young rescue bobcat, half wild and half home, making the Blue Ridge mornings feel new again. Before we get to all that, the goofy antics, the shredded cushions, the way this bobcat would crash through Walter's careful routines, we're going to watch the first collision. The night hunger and rain drove a wild heart straight into that kitchen. As you listen, you might want to picture your own chair, your own mug, your own window, the quiet places that hold your days, because that's exactly where Rowan was about to walk in. The first real morning with Rowan showed Walter 2 truths at the same time. This little rescue bobcat was starving, and he was dangerous. When the light came up over the Blue Ridge, the storm had moved on. The cabin felt washed out and quiet again, but the kitchen told the story of the night before. Water prints on the floor. Muffin's bowl was licked so clean it could have gone back in the cabinet, and curled in the corner, keeping one wary eye open, was the lean, spotted shape that shouldn't have been there at all. Up close, without the blur of rain and panic, Rowan looked smaller than Walter remembered. Not small enough to be safe, just small enough to worry about. His fur lay rough over angles that shouldn't be that sharp. Every new sound, the click of the stove,
The creak in the floorboards made his ears twitch and his muscles tighten, like he was ready to run even though there was nowhere to go. Walter moved slowly. He opened a can of cat food for Muffin, then another for the bobcat, setting it down at a distance like a peace offering. Rowan didn't hesitate. He crossed the space between them with that low, careful walk wild animals have. Every step measured, and then he swallowed the whole meal so fast it almost scared Walter more than if he'd growled. "Easy," Walter said quietly. "Nobody's taking it from you." Of course, Rowan didn't know English, but he knew the tone. He glanced up once, pupils wide, and then kept eating. Muffin watched from the safety of a chair, tail thudding softly against the cushion. Offended, but curious. That first week felt like living with a storm trapped inside four walls. Rowan paced the cabin in restless loops, nose to the floor, testing every corner. He bumped his head into the glass door more than once, misjudging the invisible barrier. Muffin took a kind of smug comfort in that. House cats know about invisible rules. Bobcats have to learn. But the wild showed through too. The muscles under that thin coat. The way he could go from completely still to halfway across the room in one heartbeat. The first time he pounced on a throw pillow and shredded it into pieces, Walter saw the flash of power behind the play. Feathers went everywhere. Muffin flopped into the pile like she'd been waiting her whole life for a down pillow explosion. Walter just stared at Rowan, chest tight, realizing that same swipe could have opened his arm if it had landed wrong. That night, he sat in the chair by the window with his phone in his hand and worry in his chest. He typed, "Bobcat rescue near me," with slow, clumsy thumbs. A listing for a wildlife rehabilitator popped up. Someone down in town who worked with foxes, hawks, and the occasional wildcat. He hesitated, thumb over the call button. On one side of the scale, safety, legality, doing what was right on paper. On the other hand, a half-grown bobcat who had chosen his porch in a storm and now slept curled near the heater as he'd finally found a place where his bones could rest. Walter hit call. The voice on the other end was calm and practical. Walter explained the situation as best he could, leaving out the part where he'd already started thinking of Rowan as his bobcat. The rehabber asked questions. Was Rowan eating? Any signs of injury, aggression? Could he go in and out on his own? They talked about rabies vaccines, about enrichment, and about what a healthy bobcat should weigh. They talked about risk, to Walter, to neighbors, even to Rowan if he got too comfortable around humans. The answer surprised him. It wasn't a sharp no. It was a careful, it depends. The rehabber said, "Most bobcats don't want anything to do with us. If he's choosing you, that's unusual. We'll work out a plan. But he's still wild, sir. Don't forget that." After he hung up, Walter sat for a long time in the dim light, listening to the soft sounds of the cabin. Rowan's claws on the floor, Muffin's low purr, his own heart ticking slower than it had in that first startled moment at the door. The real test came with the first thunderstorm after Rowan arrived. The sky over the Blue Ridge turned bruised and dark by mid-afternoon. Walter could feel the change in the air, the way folks with old injuries feel it in their joints. The first rumble rolled down the valley, distant but steady. Rowan froze. Not just a flinch. His whole body locked up. Eyes wide, ears flat. He looked toward the door like a person might look toward a highway they once broke down on. Then the lightning hit closer, and the thunder followed fast, loud enough to make the window rattle. Rowan dove under the kitchen table, shaking. Not the proud, aloof rescue bobcat who casually stole Muffin's food, just a scared, soaked memory in fur, reliving some storm in some patch of forest where there was no dry floor and no one to open a door. Without really thinking it through, Walter slid out of his chair and sat on the floor nearby. His knees complained, but he ignored them. He started humming an old tune, the same one Eleanor used to hum when storms got too loud. Not for himself this time, but for the trembling shape under the table. It took a while. Another roll of thunder, another flash of light. And then, slowly, Rowan's breathing began to match the rhythm. He edged closer, inch by inch, until his side was pressed against Walter's shin. Muffin appeared, hopped down,
and settled in the space between them like she'd been assigned to keep watch. Somewhere in the middle of that storm, the story shifted. This wasn't just about a kind man letting a wild animal stay dry. It wasn't just about a rescue bobcat getting a second chance. Greetings there on the kitchen floor, humming over the sound of rain and thunder. Walter realized something almost embarrassing to admit. He was the one being rescued, too. He'd been drifting in quiet for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed in the middle of the night. To have someone, anyone, lean into him for comfort. To be the solid thing another frightened heart anchored to. If you've ever had an animal choose your lap on a hard day, or curl up against you when you didn't even know you were shaking until they stilled you, you know that feeling. It doesn't fix everything, but it reminds you there's still something worth showing up for. The risk didn't vanish after that storm. Rowan was still wild, still strong, still capable of breaking skin or breaking rules. Walter still had numbers taped to the fridge, the vet, the rehabber, the neighbor, just in case. But the fear and the gratitude started living side by side. From here, the story widens. It stops being just a man and his bobcat in a cabin and starts tugging at the lives connected to them. A granddaughter in the city, a son on the other end of a worried phone call. Strangers on the internet watching a rescue bobcat's goofy antics from their own quiet living rooms. Before we step into that wider circle, you might take a second and think about who or what has rescued you in ordinary ways. The dog that got you out walking again, the cat that made you laugh after a funeral, the friend who knocked on your door when you'd stopped answering the phone. Those small rescues matter. Next, we'll see how Rowan and Muffin became more than company for Walter, how their chaos and comfort started stitching him back into his family and, in a quiet way, into the world. If you had walked into Walter's cabin a month after Rowan arrived, you would have thought you'd opened the wrong door. The same four walls were there, same chair, same window, same old coffee mug on the table. But the air had changed. The quiet had a pulse now, and right in the middle of it, one round house cat named Muffin, one slender rescue bobcat named Rowan, and a man who was slowly remembering how to laugh. It didn't happen all at once. Found family rarely does. At first, Muffin treated Rowan like a rude guest who'd overstayed his welcome. She'd sit on the back of the couch, watching him with narrowed eyes while he prowled the edges of the room, testing boundaries. Rowan, for his part, seemed torn between curiosity and confusion. He knew how to stalk rabbits and listen for owls. He did not understand why the refrigerator door wouldn't open when he wanted it to. That became their first joint project. One afternoon, Walter pretended to read the paper at the kitchen table while he watched the two of them out of the corner of his eye. Muffin waddled over to the fridge and wedged her paw under the bottom edge, jiggling it with all the authority of a cat who'd spent years studying human weaknesses. The door moved just a hair. Rowan watched closely, head tilted. Then he stepped in, bigger shoulders, stronger legs, curiosity on full display. Muffin showed him where to hook a paw. Rowan added the muscle. Together they annoyed that old rubber seal until the door sighed open an inch, then two, then more, a cool wave of air spilling out along with the smell of leftover chicken. The moment Rowan's nose twitched toward the shelf, Walter cleared his throat and stood up. Both animals froze. Then, like children caught with their hands in the cookie jar, they scattered in opposite directions, fur puffed, claws skittering on the floor. The fridge door swung lazily shut. Walter should have been mad. Instead, he leaned on the counter and laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from surprise rather than habit. A rescue bobcat and a house cat teaming up to break into the fridge? No one would have believed him if he'd tried to explain it. That was the first time he wished Eleanor could see it. In the evenings, when the light turned gold over the Blue Ridge, the three of them would end up in the living room almost without planning it. Walter is in the chair, Muffin on the armrest, Rowan on the rug at first, then stretched across Walter's feet, like a striped, living blanket. The TV might be on some nights, but more often than not, they just listen to the crackle of the wood stove and the small sounds animals make when they're at ease. The cabin started to feel less like a museum and more like a home again. The bridge back to his kids came from a place he didn't expect, a video call on a Wednesday evening. His granddaughter Sophie rang him from her small apartment in Chicago, the city lights blinking in the window behind her. She wanted to check on him, as she always said, but this time he answered with Muffin already balanced on his shoulder, and Rowan attempting to fit himself into Walter's lap like he was still half his size. Sophie's laugh came through the speaker, bright and immediate. "Grandpa, what on earth? Is that a bobcat?" Walter fumbled to adjust the phone so she could see. Rowan blinked at the screen, whiskers twitching. Muffin chose that exact moment to turn around and plant her tail directly over the camera. The picture went all four and no context. By the time he cleared the view, Sophie had tears in her eyes. Not from sadness, but from laughing so hard. "You live with a rescue bobcat," she said. "Do you understand how wild that sounds? You have to share this, Grandpa. People would watch. I'd watch." He shrugged, uncomfortable and a little shy. "Nobody wants to see an old man and his mistakes." She shook her head. "Correction. They want to see an old man whose best mistake has spots and keeps trying to steal the fridge." She walked him, step by tiny step, through setting up a simple channel on his phone, showed him where to press to record, how to upload. When it came time to type in a title, she grinned. "Try this. I live with a rescue bobcat who became my best mistake. His goofy antics never stop." That's what this is, isn't it? Walter read the words on the screen, feeling something loosen in his chest. For years, he'd thought of that night at the back door as a slip in his judgment, as something he'd have to explain to his son Eric, with apologies ready. Now, for the first time, he saw it through Sophie's eyes instead. Not as a failure, but as a turning point. A few days later, Eric called. He'd seen the videos, a bobcat on the kitchen counter, Muffin sprawled on the table, Walter in the background, half laughing, half trying to sound stern. "Dad," Eric said, trying to keep his voice steady, "is this safe? Are you sure you know what you're doing?" It wasn't an accusation. Underneath the words was fear, the kind of fear adult children carry when they realize they're too far away to fix things. Walter could have shut down, could have joked it away. Instead, he took a breath and did something new. "I'm being careful," he said. "I've talked with folks who know about bobcats. Got numbers on the fridge if anything goes sideways. And I'm happier than I've been in a long time, son. I didn't realize how quiet it had gotten here until it wasn't." There was a pause on the line. Then Eric exhaled. "You sound different, in a good way." The bridge wasn't rebuilt in one call, but the planks were being laid. A link was sent here, a video was shared there. Sophie texts him screenshots of comments from strangers, saying Rowan's ridiculous antics made their mornings better. People in apartments, in suburbs, in farmhouses miles from anywhere, all watching a bobcat and a house cat in a mountain cabin and feeling just a little less alone. Some families come through blood, some through paper and signatures, and some sneak in on muddy paws and refuse to leave. If you've ever had a pet become the common language between generations, the thing your kids and grandkids ask about first, the thing they send photos of, the thing you text updates about even when it's hard to talk about yourself, you know how powerful that can be. It's not that the hurt disappears, it's that love has a new way to move. As Walter's found family settled into its own odd rhythm, the world outside the cabin kept changing too. Seasons are turning on the ridges, snow on the pines. Summer thunderstorms are building over the Blue Ridge and rolling down the valley. The land itself had a say in this story. In the next part, we'll step outside with Walter, Muffin, and Rowan, and let the mountains speak a little. See how the forest and the wild creek and the quiet trails shaped this rescue bobcat and the man who opened his door. For now, if you're listening with someone you love, or with an animal who's become family in their own stubborn way, you might take a second to notice how much life they've smuggled into your everyday. Sometimes the bridge back to each other shows up in fur. The mountains had been there long before Walter, long before Muffin, long before a rescue bobcat named Rowan ever thought about slipping through a kitchen door. They held his little cabin the way a cupped hand holds water. Gentle, steady, never in a hurry. For a long time, Walter had looked at those ridge lines like they were a backdrop, a pretty picture in the window while he went about his quiet routines. Rowan changed that. The first time Walter really noticed it was a cold morning in January, the kind of morning where the Blue Ridge looks almost black against a pale sky. Overnight, snow had settled across the hills and tucked itself into every branch, every fence post, every rooftop in sight.
Walter shuffled into the kitchen, called out his usual roll call, and got only one answer.
Muffin yawned from the back of the couch, stretching like she'd been awake for hours. Rowan's usual chirp didn't come. Walter tried again, a little louder. Nothing. He found himself at the window before he even meant to move. The yard was untouched, no tracks, no sign of bobcat or anything else. The gate at the edge of the property stood half open, frost clinging to the metal. For a moment, the old fear came back. That thick, empty feeling he knew too well. It would be easy for a wild animal to disappear into those woods and never come back. That's what wild things do. They leave. He stood there with his coffee cooling in his hands, staring out at the blank white hillside, telling himself not to care too much. Then, just as he was about to turn away, a shape appeared at the tree line. Rowan moved through the snow like the land had been made to fit him. Tie low, paws careful, head up. Snowflakes dusted his fur. His footprints stitched a single line behind him, winding down from the darker woods to the open yard. He stopped for a second, lifted his face into the cold air, and then trotted toward the cabin with the easy confidence of someone coming home. By the time he landed on the porch, Walter was at the door, holding it open. Rowan stepped inside without hesitation, shaking snow onto the mat, pupils narrowing in the warmer light. Muffin chirped a greeting from her post. The house felt full again. That became a pattern. Some mornings, Rowan greeted the sunrise from the window, pressed close to the glass, mist blowing from his nose as he watched deer move between the trees. Other days, he was gone before dawn, slipping through the same gap in the fence to patrol the hillside. He came back with pine needles in his fur, burrs in his tail, the faint smell of creaks and leaf mold clinging to him like a story he couldn't quite tell. Walter started looking up bobcats at night, scrolling through articles on his phone with the same focus he'd once used to study repair manuals. He learned that Rowan wasn't just a funny roommate with spots. He was part of a larger map. Bobcats helped keep rodent and rabbit numbers in check, quietly balancing out fields and forest edges. They chose territories and marked them, their invisible boundaries crossing property lines and county lines without caring who owned what. Most people never saw them, even living right next to them for years. Just tracks in the mud, pressed like signatures into the earth. The more he read, the more Walter's view shifted. When he heard coyotes in the distance now, or an owl calling from a dark branch, he didn't feel so small and alone. He felt included, like he and the cabin and even the gravel road were just one small part of a bigger, breathing place. He also learned harder things. Articles about habitats getting carved up by new roads. Stories about bobcats hit by cars on back highways are not that different from the one he took into town. Photos of wildfires creeping too close to forests he'd never been to, but suddenly cared about anyway because somewhere out there, animals with ears like Rowan's were trying to outrun heat and smoke. One night, after uploading a short video of Rowan and Muffin doing what he called synchronized begging at the fridge, Walter clicked on a link someone had left in the comments. It led to a small local group working on wildlife crossings in his county, places where animals could pass under or over busy roads without becoming another roadside story. He sat there a long time with his wallet on the table, thumb sliding over his debit card. He didn't have much money to throw around. Fixed income. Groceries are creeping up. But the thought of a bobcat like Rowan walking into headlights instead of snow made his chest tighten. In the end, he sent a little. Not enough to brag about. Enough to feel like he'd taken a small step from, I live with a rescue bobcat, to, I live in bobcat country, and I care what happens to them. He didn't give a speech about it. In the next video, He just mentioned, almost in passing, if Rowan's antics have made you smile. There's a group down the road trying to give his wild cousins a safer shot out there. If you ever feel like helping, that's where I send a few dollars when I can. That was it. Quiet. Simple, like everything else about his days. The land around him kept changing with the seasons. Spring pushed green shoots through the old snow. Summer wrapped the ridges in heat and birdsong. Autumn laid down its own red and gold quilt. Through it all, Rowan slipped between house and hillside, wild and home, the line between the two softening just enough for Walter to see his place in it more clearly. If you've ever stepped outside at dusk, just to stand in your own yard and listen, crickets, a dog barking down the street, maybe a train in the distance, you know how the world can suddenly feel both bigger and more personal at the same time. That's what the Blue Ridge began to be for Walter. Not background, not silence. A kind of steady companion. And while the land and this rescue bobcat were waking something up in him, his own body was sending quieter messages. A skipped beat here, a dizzy spell there. The kind of things people our age tend to wave off until we can't. In the next part, we'll stay close as his health and his wild-hearted nurse with whiskers collide, and see how aging, risk, and being watched over start to weave into this story. For now, if it's possible where you are, maybe crack a window or step onto a porch for a minute tonight, just to listen. You might be surprised how much is living just beyond the glass. The first time Walter realized he wasn't the only one doing the watching in that cabin, it was because his body finally made him sit down and listen. It started on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind of day that feels like a copy of the one before it. Coffee brewing, kettle hissing. Muffin was winding around his ankles, trying to speed up breakfast with a few well-placed nudges. Walter stood at the counter, reached for the cupboard, and the world tilted. Not a little head rush, the whole room shifted sideways as the cabin itself had slipped on the mountain. His hand missed the mug entirely. The counter edge was suddenly too far away. His heart kicked once, then twice, too fast, too loud. He grabbed for the nearest chair and mostly missed. Ended up half sitting, half sliding down until he was hunched at the kitchen table, forehead resting on his arms, trying to breathe past the spinning. At first, he did what a lot of us do. He told himself it was nothing, didn't sleep right, didn't drink enough water. It'll pass. But to Rowan and Muffin, something was very clearly wrong. Muffin's usual soft meow turned sharp, almost scolding. She hopped onto the table, then down, then back up again, pacing. Rowan let out a sound Walter had never heard from him. Not the chirp he used when he wanted food, not the low rumble he used when a stranger's truck came up the gravel road. This was higher, almost frantic. A wild, clipped call that bounced off the walls. Rowan trotted a tight circle around the table, then bolted down the hallway toward the bedroom. Walter heard claws rake against wood as the rescue bobcat scratched at the closed door, then back again, then to the front door, nails clicking on the floor, throwing his whole body into making noise. It was ridiculous in a way. Two animals who couldn't dial a phone, trying everything else. The racket finally pushed Walter through the fog. He forced himself to lift his head, to peel one hand off the cool surface of the table and reach for his cell. His fingers felt thick, clumsy, but he managed to hit the button for his neighbor. By the time Mr. Dorsey's truck pulled up, Rowan was planted by the window, tail twitching, eyes fixed on the driveway like he'd summoned that vehicle by will alone. Muffin stayed glued to Walter's chair, a warm weight against his leg, as if to make sure he didn't slide right off the earth. At urgent care, under harsh lights and the beep of machines, the words came. Blood pressure, arrhythmia, new medication. You're not 20 anymore, Mr. Hayes. The doctor talked about risk, falls, and what it means to live alone in the hills at his age. Walter nodded as he understood. But what he kept seeing over and over was Rowan pacing the hallway, sounding the alarm. Back at the cabin, the instructions came with him. Pills in a plastic organizer, a list taped to the fridge. Less salt,
more water. A follow-up visit is already on the calendar. For a man who'd spent years pretending he didn't mind if the road got short, it felt strange to be given homework for staying. The two nurses with whiskers took the assignment seriously. Every morning, before he'd finished his first cup of coffee, Rowan would come over and sniff his hand like he was checking a chart. Sometimes he'd touch his nose to Walter's wrist, pause, and then settle satisfied at his feet. Muffin chose the pillbox as her post. If Walter walked past it without stopping, she'd tap it with her paw, nails clicking against plastic, a subtle reminder that he wasn't the only one on a schedule. On days when the doctor wanted him walking, Walter would bundle up and step outside, the cold, Blue Ridge air catching in his chest. Rowan padded a few paces ahead, turning back every so often to make sure he was still coming. Muffin trailed behind, complaining about the weather but refusing to stay indoors alone.
Two nurses with whiskers, Walter muttered once, halfway down the driveway, breath puffing white. Didn't see that one coming. The next checkup told its own story. Numbers better, color better. The doctor tilted his head and said, "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Walter shrugged, thinking of the rescue bobcat who refused to let him nap through his medication time, of the cat who sat on the bathroom counter every night until he brushed his teeth. "I've got help," he said, "the furry kind." There was another side to this too. Taking Rowan and Muffin to the vet for their own visits became part of the rhythm. The first time he walked in with Rowan in a heavy crate, the receptionist blinked. "Is that?" "Bobcat," Walter said gently. "Rescue situation. We've got a rehabber advising us." He laid out the story without drama. The vet listened, cautious but kind, and together they came up with a plan. Vaccines, checks, boundaries, respect for the wild in the middle of a house. Suddenly in that waiting room, watching Rowan's ears swivel at every sound, Walter realized something simple that he'd somehow missed. Taking care of himself wasn't just about him anymore. If he checked out early, these two would be left confused and grieving. The neighbor might take them in, a shelter might step up, but they wouldn't understand why the chair by the window stayed empty. For a man who had been drifting for years, it was a strange kind of motivation. Stay alive, not out of stubbornness, but out of responsibility to two small hearts who watched him like the sun coming up. If you've ever noticed your dog staring at you until you put your shoes on and go for that walk, or your cat yelling at you when you're late with bedtime routines, you felt a bit of this. They don't know the medical terms, but they notice when our patterns change. They pull us toward the basics: move, eat, rest, connect. In Walter's cabin, health and aging stopped being topics to dodge and became part of the daily conversation, even if the words were mostly purrs and chirps. As his body steadied under new medicine and new habits, another, quieter shift started happening. The same man who'd once hidden his grief, his fear, his tears, began sharing more of himself. First with two animals who never judged him, and then, slowly, with the people watching his rescue bobcat's antics online. That's where we're headed next, into the late-night captions, the shaky first videos where he talks more about his heart than his refrigerator, and the way an old man in the Blue Ridge found his voice again with a bobcat purring on his lap. Before we go there, you might consider one small thing for yourself. If you've been ignoring a checkup, or brushing off those little dizzy spells, maybe let the creatures or the people who love you be your reminder. Sometimes staying around a little longer is the kindest thing we can do for them. The first time Walter turned the camera around on himself instead of on the animals, his finger hovered over the record button for a long time. Up until then, the channel had been simple, easy. Point the phone at the rescue bobcat trying to wedge himself into Muffin's too small bed, tap to record when Rowan hopped on the counter to supervise dinner. Film their synchronized begging routine in front of the fridge. Post, walk away. The captions were just as plain. Somebody thinks he's starving again. She says the couch is hers. He disagrees. Life with a bobcat. Send help. Jokes were safe. Jokes didn't ask for anything. Most nights, after he uploaded a clip, Walter would sit in his chair by the window with the lights down low, scrolling through comments as the Blue Ridge Hills faded into the dark outside. People from all over, Ohio, Texas, Maine, little towns he'd never heard of, leaving notes about how Rowan and Muffin made them smile after hard days. One woman wrote, "My husband passed last year. Watching your rescue bobcat be so gentle with your old cat gives me hope." A man from Arizona said, "Haven't laughed in weeks. Your goofy bobcat just broke that streak." Walter read those words with the phone resting against the same chest that still ached when he thought of Eleanor. He answered with a wave of his hand at first, a quick heart icon, a thank you, nothing more. But something in him stirred each time he saw strangers admitting things he'd barely admitted to himself. One evening, the power flickered off during a storm. The cabin dropped into a softer kind of dark, lit only by the wood stove and a small battery lantern. Rain tapped at the windows. Rowan was stretched across his lap, purring in that rough, rolling way bobcats do. Muffin had claimed her usual corner of the armchair. With the house quiet, the grief he usually kept pressed down rose, steady and insistent. He thought of Eleanor's picture on the shelf, of her voice on that one saved voicemail, of all the words he hadn't said out loud in 3 years, because there was no one to hear them the way she would have. Without really deciding to, he reached for the candle he kept by her photo, a small one, unscented, something he'd picked up in town without ceremony. He lit it and set it on the table, its glow catching the edges of her smile in the frame. "Missed you today," he murmured. Not a prayer, exactly. Not anything formal, just a sentence dropped into the quiet. Rowan's purr deepened, as if the sound of Walter's voice settled something in him, too. The phone was on the table beside the candle. The little red record icon waited. "Why not?" he sighed. He propped the phone up against a mug, angled it so you could see Rowan and Muffin and the candlelight, and pressed record. For a few seconds, he just sat there, listening to the bobcat, watching the small flame move. Then he started talking. He didn't use big words. He didn't try to make it poetic. He just said what was true. That he'd thought his life was over the day Eleanor didn't wake up. That the cabin had turned from their dream into a place he was half afraid of. It took a stray house cat and a half-frozen bobcat crashing into his kitchen to remind him there was still something in him that could care. He told the little rectangle of glass that some days he still woke up angry she wasn't there, that some nights he still reached for her side of the bed. He admitted, voice catching once, that he had no idea how to be both grateful for Rowan and Muffin, and still honest about the ache that never quite left. He didn't talk about faith in any official way. He didn't quote anything or offer answers. He just glanced at the photo frame and said, "If you had any hand in sending these two to my porch that night, I see what you were doing now." Rowan shifted, pressing closer. Muffin blinked slowly at the camera. When he finished, there was a long silence. Then he hit stop. For a moment, he almost deleted the whole thing. Too exposed, too raw, no jokes to hide behind. Instead, he added a simple caption, "For anyone else who's loved and lost, and somehow ended up with a house full of fur." He went to bed expecting to wake up regretting it. The next morning, the video had more comments than anything he'd ever posted. Not because it went viral, just because people recognized themselves. Men who'd never said a word about their feelings in public typing, "Same here, buddy." Widows mentioned the dogs that got them out of the house when they wanted to stay under the cover. Conks living alone in apartments talking about how watching a rescue bobcat in the Blue Ridge made their own rooms feel less tight. Reading their stories, Walter felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Useful. Not in the way he'd once been, fixing engines or hauling lumber. Useful in the way a porch light is on a night. Not solving everything, just letting people see where the steps are. From then on, the channel held both sides of his life. Some days it was all antics. Rowan stealing socks, Muffin pushing him off the pillow, the pair of them staring down a carton of eggs like they were planning a heist. Other days, the caption slipped a little deeper. Bad heart day, good company. Storm rolling in, missing her. Bobcat won't leave my side. Getting older, but not alone. He still deletes the really heavy words sometimes before posting. Old habits don't disappear overnight, but more and more, he let them stay. If you've ever written something honest in a message, then hovered over the send button, you know that tremor, that question. Is it safe to be this real? Watching strangers respond with their own honesty started to answer that for him. His world, which had shrunk to a chair, a mug, and a window, quietly expanded into a community that stretched across states and time zones. People who would never sit on his porch still knew the color of his bobcat's spots and the way he talked about his late wife. And somewhere in that exchange, his hidden ache stopped being something he had to protect and became something he could share. As his heart opened to this small online circle, another question rose to the surface. One he'd been able to ignore when it was just him and the mountains, but not now. Not with two animals leaning their whole lives against his. What happens to Rowan and Muffin if his heart finally says, "That's enough"? In the last part of this story, we'll walk with him to that door. The real one he opens to the forest, and the invisible one he opens in his mind as he starts planning for a future he might not see. A future where the little family he built out of hunger, fur, and second chances still finds its way. Before we go there, you might take a quiet minute later tonight and notice if there's one sentence you've been swallowing for years. Maybe just for yourself. Write it down. You don't have to post it anywhere. Sometimes, seeing our own truth in black and white is the first small crack in the shell we've been living in. The morning Walter chose to leave the door open. The sky over the Blue Ridge was that soft kind of blue that makes you feel like the day hasn't quite decided what it wants to be yet. He woke up with a thought that wouldn't go away. If he loved this rescue bobcat as much as he said he did, he had to trust him with a choice. Not just food. Not just sleeping spots, a real choice. House or hills? He made his coffee, fed Muffin, and instead of closing the porch door like he always did, he unlatched it and stepped aside. The outside air rolled in, damp earth, pine, a faint chill, even though spring was trying hard. Rowan appeared at the edge of the room the way he always did when something was different. Quiet, alert. He paused in the doorway, then padded over until he stood right where wood met world. You could feel the whole story balanced in that small strip of space. On one side, the cabin, with its chair and its window and its fridge raids and late-night videos. On the other hand, the ridge, where a bobcat could move without bumping into furniture, where no one would tell him he couldn't hunt or climb for hours. Walter's hand rested on the knob, knuckles white. "You're not a prisoner here," he said softly. "You get to choose." Rowan lifted his head, ears flicking toward a sound Walter couldn't hear. A crow somewhere, a chipmunk scolding. The creek runs down the slope. His tail twitched once, twice. This was the moment every wildlife rehabber and article had warned him about, in one way or another. Wild hearts aren't meant to be owned, they're meant to decide. For a long breath, it looked like Rowan might take the woods. He stepped outside, paused silent on the worn porch boards, then trotted down the steps into the grass. Walter stayed where he was, one hand on the frame to steady himself. Every old fear waking up at once. Losing Eleanor. Merely passed out in the kitchen, the empty years before Muffin. He told himself, the way you talk to a scared child in your own chest, that this was the right thing. Let the bobcat be a bobcat. If he doesn't come back, you loved him enough to give him that. Time stretched. Muffin hopped up onto the windowsill, eyes tracking the small shape as it moved toward the edge of the yard. Rowan paused once at the fence gap, the one he'd used 100 times before, then slipped through and disappeared behind young pines. The space he left behind felt louder than any thunderstorm. Walter didn't move. Part of him wanted to slam the door, march back to his chair and pretend he'd never opened it. Another part, the part that had been rescued too many times to deny it, knew this was the test of what they'd built together. Found family doesn't work if only one side gets to choose. He made it to lunchtime on habit alone, fed Muffin, straightened the blanket on the couch, checked the porch 3 times more than he needed to. The Blue Ridge sat outside as calm as ever, like the mountains had seen this kind of waiting before and knew it takes what it takes. It was almost dusk when he heard it, that familiar steady thump of paws on the porch. Not frantic, not hesitant, just home. Walter opened the door in time to see Rowan shake off a bit of leaf litter and look up at him with that same strange mix of wild and comfortable he'd first seen on them. Night of the storm. No drama, no big reunion. Rowan just walked past him into the cabin, tail brushing his leg like it was the most normal thing in the world. He hopped up into Walter's chair, settled into the warm dent with a heavy sigh, and blinked as if to say, "Your turn." Walter let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding all day and sat down. Muffin, not about to miss a moment, wedged herself between them. In that simple movement, out, then back, forest to fireside, something shifted in how Walter thought about all of it. This wasn't a bobcat he was keeping. This was a bobcat who kept coming back. That choice mattered. It changed how he thought about his own future too. That night, after the cabin had gone quiet and the animals were asleep, he sat at the table with a pen and a pad of paper. He wrote down the numbers of the rehabber, the vet, his neighbor, Sophie, and Eric. He wrote out what he wanted if his heart finally decided enough was enough. Rowan evaluated by the rehabber, given every chance to live wild and safe. Muffin placed with family if she couldn't handle it. He tucked that note in with his will, not because he was planning to go anywhere tomorrow, but because knowing they'd be cared for if he did made it easier to close his eyes at night. Legacy, he realized, wasn't just about kids or bank accounts or whose name ends up on a plaque somewhere. Sometimes legacy is as simple as the paw prints you leave on a life that needed you. A rescue bobcat who learned to trust an old man. An old man who learned to show up for himself because a cat and a bobcat expected breakfast on time. A small, online circle of people who found comfort in the sight of a wild heart napping on a patchwork throw. As the channel grew slowly, Walter never chased numbers. He kept posting the same way he lived, one honest moment at a time. A bobcat batting at snowflakes. A quiet clip of Muffin and Rowan sleeping under Eleanor's old quilt. A short video where he said, almost shyly, "If these two make your day softer, I'm glad. They sure did that for me." Somewhere along the line, saying goodbye stopped feeling like a single dramatic moment and started feeling more like an ongoing practice. Opening doors, trusting choices, making plans for after you're gone, and loving fully anyway. If you're still here with Walter's story in your ears, maybe take a breath and notice what doors are standing half closed in your own life. Is there a conversation you've been putting off? A plan you've avoided making because it feels too final? Or maybe it's a softer thing. A walk you've been meaning to take. A photo you've been meaning to frame. An animal at the shelter whose eyes you haven't forgotten. When this video ends, give yourself a quiet moment to ask, what do I want to keep? And what can I lovingly set free? If this time in the Blue Ridge Mountains, with one old man, one determined house cat, and one stubborn rescue bobcat has brought you any comfort, I'd be grateful if you'd tap like, subscribe, and stay with us for more stories. And if you feel moved to go a step further, a warm super thanks or small donation helps us keep sharing and supports the people out there rescuing and healing wild animals like bobcats who still show up at the wrong doors on rainy nights, hoping someone will open them.